You're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome to the Teach Thought Podcast. Our mission is to rethink what's possible teaching and learning in a modern context. Join your classroom to the Teach Thought movement and be a part of the change.
Thanks for tuning in to the Teach Thought Podcast once again. I'm Drew Perkins, the Director of Professional Development here, and if you are looking for ways to grow your school in personalized and innovative ways, please jump on over to our website, which is teachthought.com/PD. There you'll find all kinds of different service areas, and we'd love to put together a personalized plan that we keep affordable so we can make the work sustainable and high quality. In today's podcast, I spoke with Dr. Rick DuFour about his new book, In Praise of American Educators and How They Can Become Even Better. We broke this into two podcasts because our conversation went so long, and it actually fits well because his book kind of breaks into two parts. One, which is really kind of looking at the status quo of education and his assessment of that, and then, of course, his work around PLCs and what we need to do in order to make PLCs a reality in our schools. This first half will really kind of focus again on his frustration about the status quo and people's take on that, what PLCs have become and what they should be, how we have a personal responsibility to move that work forward. We talked about achievement and the purpose of school and his take on the coverage of content versus enduring and essential understandings and curriculum versus content. Enjoy the podcast. Well, welcome to the podcast, Rick DuFour. You have a fairly new book here called In Praise of American Educators that is pretty direct and pretty strong messages. So kind of give us a little bit of a background of why you wrote this book and what you're really hoping to accomplish, and then we can dive into some of the pieces and parts of it, if you don't mind.
Sure, that'd be great. I think the reason is twofold in terms of why I wrote the book. And the book itself is pretty much divided into two parts to address both of the objectives. And the first part was to debunk the idea that American schools are failing and that they're terrible and getting worse, when in fact, virtually any objective indicator of school effectiveness, whether it's student achievement, parent satisfaction, student satisfaction, access to greater rigor in curriculum, greater access for minority and low SES students, are far better today than they have been in any other generation of educators. And so in the first part of the book, I refer to educators today as our greatest generation and try to make the case as to why that's true. I try and also debunk the current reform strategies that are prevalent in the United States. And those are strategies that, by and large, are punitive, sanction-driven, threatening, fear-based, and have not proven successful not only in the United States, but nowhere in the world where students are achieving at high levels are those strategies being used. So I look at things like school choice and No Child Left Behind and intensive evaluation of teachers based on VAT testing and so on, and try and just demonstrate that virtually all of them run contrary to the research in terms of what we know to be best practice in schools. I think that educators have been maligned, that it's been unfair and inaccurate, and I tried in the first half of the book to defend our profession, which I think warrants tremendous gratitude and praise for what they've accomplished in the face of having the highest percentage of students of poverty ever in the history of the United States attending public schools, and in the face of having 1 out of every 5 students speaking a language other than English in their homes. So we have some of the most difficult conditions ever, challenging students, budget cuts, and yet teachers are getting the best results we've ever had in our history. The second half of the book, I try to make the case that even though we are getting our best results, it's absolutely imperative that we begin to acknowledge that those results are nowhere near good enough given the current realities that our students are facing today. That in the past, a student could drop out of high school, still have access to good paying jobs and access to the middle class, and that simply is absolutely no longer true, and try and provide a lot of data and evidence to support that. And that in fact, we now have to be committed to schools, not that merely give kids the opportunity to learn, but we've got to create schools in which we're committed to helping all students learn at high levels. And so the second half of the book, I try and lay out, this is what we know to be best practice. There's no real debate about whether or not it's best practice, and we have to accept responsibility for bringing those best practices into our schools and making them the norm rather than the exception.
So there's 11 chapters here, and as I'm reading through it, I mean, in the time that we have on the podcast, I'm hoping that we can really address and talk about several things. But I think maybe the first 5 chapters are that first part, and then you start to get into more the PLCs, and of course you're one of the pioneers or the pioneer of PLC work and that concept. And so one of the things that you really note, and there's a tone here that comes through pretty clearly, and you mentioned it too, is that this sort of is born out of a sense of frustration, and you really do take some things, some fairly, what people might say is controversial approaches or at least issues, talking about teachers unions and talking about merit pay, talking about charters. And I love the chapter, the name of chapter 3, The Firings Will Continue Until Morale Improves. When I was in the classroom, one of the more recent classrooms I was teaching in, we used to sort of sarcastically joke about the beatings will continue until morale improves. And, I think you really... It is a really interesting piece as you sort of take both sides in a very well thought out handling of these things, but really being quite honest. Is this, I guess talk about that frustration if you would, because it really does seem to come through pretty clearly.
Well, it is frustration at 2 levels. One is the frustration that again, educators are being maligned. At the same time, they're getting the best results in the history of the United States. And I think anybody with a sense of equity and fairness should be frustrated and offended by the fact that politicians and pundits continue to refer to our schools as failing. And I'm also frustrated in the second half of the book that what we know to be the things that will help more students and adults learn at higher levels are not yet the norm in American schools. And as I mentioned in the introduction of the book, I think part of this book was driven by not only frustration, but by a sense of urgency. I was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer.
Right.
I know I have fewer opportunities to try and influence my profession. I've been trying to influence it, and I guess I was frustrated that I haven't had a greater influence. And so I hoped that this book would spark that the conversation, and more than conversation, would spark the changes that are necessary for schools to become better. I think we've wrung the last bit of student achievement out of an old system that was designed to sort and select students based on the assumptions about their their jobs and their economic possibilities and their innate abilities and so on. And it's time that we operate our schools with an entirely different mindset. But that's hard to do when you're trying to overcome a culture of 100 years.
Right.
I understand that.
Yeah. So, one of the frustrations that I hear from teachers, and I'm curious your take on this, as I do work with teachers around the country, and really I love the idea of PLCs and professional learning communities, but as you sort of note in the book, and teachers note, that it's been sort of co-opted and pardon my language, but sort of bastardized in a way that has not really served the purpose that I think you're really after. So, how frustrating is that to you? I mean, when I sort of joke about it, people say, oh, it's PLC time, which often is, how long is this going to take and what do we have to turn in? Which clearly was not the intent, and anybody who reads the book would that takeaway would be crystal clear. But what is that? How do you when you go to a school and you have people say, oh, PLCs, this is what they've turned into? I mean, is that another source of frustration for you?
It is, and I can't think of really any powerful idea that doesn't get bastardized along the way.
Right.
So I recognize that that's not unique to PLCs.
Sure.
But when I hear that, I ask them, well, what are you doing in your efforts to become a PLC? And ultimately have to say to them that you aren't doing any of the things that PLCs actually do. Mm-hmm. And so I think, as you pointed out, clarity precedes competence. And in order for a school to become clear on the fundamental aspects of the PLC process, they have to delve into it at a much deeper level than that many schools have up to now, where it's been very superficial. And the whole idea of a PLC in many schools is simply that we will organize people into groups and give them time to come together periodically without any clear idea as to why we're doing it or what the right work is or what our purpose is, what our goals are. And so when we find that situation, we just try and be as specific as possible and explicit as possible about these are the things that PLCs do. And there aren't a lot of them. I mean, it's not like there's 75 things you have to do to become a PLC. There are 5 or 6.
Right.
If you do all 5 or 6, you'll be a PLC. But you can't pick. You can't say, well, we'll do 3 out of 5, or, you've got to do them all.
Yeah, it really, I do and have done a lot of work around project-based learning. And of course, that's another thing that gets sort of bastardized. People say, oh, we've tried PBL and it just, it wasn't for us, or didn't work for us, or it was a train wreck or a nightmare. And you say, all right, so tell me, what was your level of inquiry? Tell me, how were you really doing it? And it said, well, you weren't really doing quality project-based learning. You were doing something that, you might have called that. And that's a frustration, that I experience. And I'd imagine that really is it's a difficult one, because it really is an ecosystem and it's really a culture, right? I mean, it's a sense of how we approach work and how we collaborate and all of those pieces and parts. Although you do make a point in PLCs and really sort of a personal responsibility, I think, and how you say, well, so if your district and school isn't doing it, as a teacher, you still have a sort of a personal professional responsibility, right, on how you can do the things that you can control to push this sort of ideal forward, right?
Exactly. And I think there is a tendency for us as a profession to look for others to improve the situation, whether it's we need the state legislature to come up with more enlightened policies, or we need parents to send us better kids, or parents to get more involved, or we need to abolish testing, or we need administrators who are more effective. But another way in which we look externally rather than internally is by saying, yes, this is the right thing to do and somebody else should do it. And I think that we see that happening, that principals are saying, I really would like my school to be a PLC, but the superintendent and district isn't on board with it. And so, what can I do?
Right.
Well, you could create a PLC in your own school and have it become a lighthouse for the district. Mm-hmm. And I would say the same thing of teachers. Sometimes I say, well, our principal just isn't really interested in it, and we need the principal to lead it. And I would argue that teachers can and should lead principals, that the best principals are constantly being informed by teachers.
Right.
And so why not, as a team of teachers, say, let's sit down with the principal and talk about what we could do to help support the PLC process in the school and what we would need from the principal. Or why not, as a team of teachers, begin to function as a PLC, even though the principal doesn't seem to be enamored with it. And let's get such good results that other people are going to have to sit up and take notice. So I don't think this is ever going to happen as long as we're waiting for somebody else to make it happen. I think as a profession, we've got to accept responsibility. I like the quote, and I'm sure I used it in the book, from Rumi, the Persian poet from the 14th century. He said, yesterday I was clever, so I was trying to change the world. Today I am wise, so I'm changing myself. I think it's time for us as a profession to become wise and to focus more on what is within our sphere of influence, because there is a lot we can do to improve schools that don't require that external support.
Yeah, it's interesting. I reflecting back on some of my teaching in my experience, and there was a school in which I was working, and there was not an effective PLC or collaborative culture, and that culture was not something that supported, I don't think, some of the ideals that you're sort of espousing in this PLC. And I do think it's important as a professional, how do we find and seek out those people that we can sort of have a de facto PLC with. And I remember having a conversation, actually seeing one of my colleagues who I hadn't really known very well as a cognitive coach, and he was speaking in front of the faculty, and I thought, man, this guy is really smart. And I almost begged him. I said, will you please, I was a classroom teacher and he was a coach. I said, will you please be a coach, and so that we can have, because I really valued those one-on-one conversations, and regretted that we didn't have more people involved in those, and there wasn't a culture that allowed for more people. But you know what? That was what I could control, and boy, I really, really valued that. It was really meaningful, thoughtful. He asked great questions. I came back with hopefully great questions and thoughts, and so it does take, you can control what you can control, right? And you've got to move it forward the way that you can.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's, I guess, what the book is calling for, is that as a profession, we take the initiative and stop being so passive. Yeah.
So as we think about one of the things that the words that you use quite a bit in this book is achievement. And thinking about that, and when I think about achievement, what comes to my mind, I've even written a blog post about a culture of achievement being test scores and closing gaps and those kinds of things. How do you define achievement? And I guess in a sense, because it really gets me to start thinking about what's the purpose of school, and how do those sort of things in your mind overlap and compare and contrast, and what is achievement, what is the purpose of school in your mind?
Well, I think the purpose of school is to prepare every student for learning, continuous learning beyond the K-12 system. Because if they're not prepared to be lifelong learners, they're going to be at a distinct disadvantage. So whether I'm teaching first grade or 11th grade, I have to be thinking in terms of what is it our kids need in order to be true lifelong learners. And I have not attempted to define and tell other people what achievement should be. I think it should be what they define and what they say they value. And so, for example, I certainly think that one of the things that's incumbent upon any educator in any school is that you present evidence of higher levels of learning for your students, that you're getting better this year than you did last year, getting better results. Now, how you present that can vary, and I leave up to each school to decide on their own. It may include state test scores, but it may include having more students pursuing rigorous curriculum. It may be a reduction in the failure rate. It may be portfolios of student work that shows tremendous growth over the course of a year or two or three. It may be student satisfaction surveys where they feel and they report that their experience is more positive and that they're learning at higher levels. So I think there are a lot of different ways that you can say, this is what success looks like. For example, in my former high school, we embraced the idea that we were trying to prepare kids for post-secondary success. That was, everybody understood. And of course, then the incumbent question becomes, well, what evidence do we have that we're preparing them for post-secondary success? And an ACT score or a state test score or results from common assessments don't necessarily give you very compelling evidence. So we began a very thorough process of following our graduates after they've left us. And we would take 15% of every graduating class. We would track them down by phone, where they would be randomly selected. Then we'd track them down by phone for an interview 1 year after they had graduated, and then 5 years after they had graduated, to ask them about not only their experience in high school, but what were they experiencing in college? Did they feel that they were well prepared? Did they feel that they were better prepared than other students attending the same college? Did they feel that we taught them to be responsible for their own learning? Our social studies department wanted to know, did you vote in the last election? How politically engaged are you? And things like that. So I think the question of how do we define success should be something that every school has an opportunity to debate on their own. But ultimately, the question becomes, however you define it, what evidence are you presenting that you're helping your kids be more successful? And that's where I think we have to accept some responsibility for the fact that things like No Child Left Behind attempted to provide some evidence that we could point to, because really, Larry Lazat said, in most schools in the United States, if you walked in and said, we are accusing you that students are learning in this school, and took you to court, the case would be thrown out for lack of evidence, that we weren't attentive enough to demonstrating that we were helping kids be successful. So however you define success, however you define achievement, it's incumbent upon you to provide multiple indicators of that achievement so that you can make the case your kids are learning.
It's interesting. And as I'm looking through the book, I'm just, as you're talking, sort of flipping through it and all the highlighted parts, because it really is a very thoughtful book. And, you talk about that our schools are not failing and provide lots of evidence, but you also note that there's lots of room for improvement. And so I don't want anybody listening to think, well, he thinks that things are just peachy keen, but, sort of looking at both pieces and both sides. Which really, gets at achievement. It gets at some of the things. One of the quotes that I really, really appreciated and was thoughtful and have highlighted, you have it bolded and sort of set aside here, is creating a viable curriculum will require educators both to assign priority to certain standards and to elect not to teach other standards, which is, in some people's minds, that's almost heresy. Like, how can we not cover these pieces? And as I just talked with somebody the other day in Boston. They were talking about professional development. They said, well, if you're thinking about project-based learning and, doing things differently, these teachers are going to really struggle because they feel like they're supposed to cover all these things, and getting people to understand that difference, that almost really shifts and begs to me the question, thinking about, somebody who, like Yang Zhao. I don't know how familiar you are with Yang Zhao and his sort of stance that standards and standardization and things like Common Core, whatever, comes from a deficit mindset, and that we shouldn't be teaching content standards per se, but really focusing on more skills and thought. What's your take on that perspective?
Well, I agree with it. I was a U.S. history teacher.
Right.
And I taught, for example, in the American Revolution, when I was a beginning teacher, I would say, what were the 5 components of the Boston Massacre, or excuse me, the Intolerable Acts after the Boston Massacre that Great Britain imposed on the colonists. And then the next year I taught, I recognized I didn't remember what the 5 components were. So what was the likelihood that the students were?
Right.
So I began to try and think in terms of, what's enduring here? What do I want kids to take away from U.S. history? And it wasn't names and dates and places. It was a sense of timeline. It was a sense of concepts that drove American history. And I think those skills and concepts should take precedent. We should be teaching the things that are enduring, that have leverage. They would cut across multiple disciplines, and that they would prepare kids for success at the next level. So I completely agree with the idea that if that's going to happen, we can't try to teach everything we've always taught and try and include project-based learning and things that deliver the curriculum at a deeper level and require higher levels of thinking. Mm-hmm. So one of the keys in my mind when it comes to curriculum is acknowledging that there is a difference between things that are essential and things that are nice to know. And we've got to have conversations at the teacher level about, so what's really essential? What is it we want our kids to take away from our grade level, our course, our subject area? And if you look at the leading countries in the world in terms of student achievement, that's the direction they're heading. Singapore has an initiative going on right now called Teach Less, Learn More,
right,
where despite the fact that they had a curriculum that was significantly less condensed or was not as comprehensive as the American curriculum, they're still looking for ways to cut into that curriculum. Finland, is touted as a high-performing country, and
sure,
their math guidelines are just a couple of pages for the whole K-12 system, whereas you get into a textbook in math in the United States, and you've got scores of concepts and skills and that kids are supposed to be taking away. So one of the things that has to happen if we want to help all kids learn at high levels is to narrow our focus in the curriculum. And teachers have to have a voice in that.
You absolutely make that point as you're talking about laying the foundation of a PLC. And you have a diagram on page 101 that I think really it aligns with some of the things that we've put out here at Teach Thought as well. Thinking about how really clarification around that mission, the vision, the values, and the goals. And you do a really nice job of talking about those in the sense of almost in a PLC culture. Like, so we want to have and need to have, and it's imperative that we have those teacher voices in there, and really ideally the community stakeholders. So what does the community really value and see as the enduring skills and thoughts and content and those kinds of things? And so when you talk about this idea of providing students, you have a chapter providing students with access to a guaranteed and viable curriculum. One of my frustrations, and I think about Common Core as being a way that this sort of manifests very, very clearly, is that people, to me, misunderstand things like standards and content, and often they view those as curriculum, and I see those as being very, very different. So, in your mind, like, how do you talk with teachers and leaders in schools around differentiating between content and standards and curriculum?
Well, there is going to be some overlap there, but by and large, curriculum is a tool, in my mind, is merely a tool for helping kids acquire the knowledge and skills that we've agreed are essential. So what should be driving us is not we're going to teach chapter 4, we're going to teach chapter 5, and let the textbook drive the curriculum, or let the state Department of Education drive the curriculum. What should be driving us are what are the outcomes, the real outcomes that we're seeking from this curriculum, and how can we best ensure that all kids achieve those outcomes. And that's where I think having a better understanding of standards and the need that they have endurance, leverage, and prepare kids for success are more important in my mind than the idea of here's the curriculum, go teach it. We in that chapter, guaranteed and viable curriculum, a lot of districts say, oh yes, we have a guaranteed and viable curriculum because we've given out a copy of the Common Core to every teacher for their grade level, or every teacher has a copy of the state standards for their grade level. And they pretend that because we've given people the same document, that A, they've read it, B, they understand it, C, they're going to assign the same priorities to all the different standards, D, that their pacing is going to be the same, or E, they even have the knowledge and skills to teach some of those standards. So I agree with Bob Marzano, who said really the only way you can have a guaranteed curriculum is if you get the guarantee from the people who actually implement the curriculum, and those are the teachers themselves. No state department, no superintendent, no principal can guarantee to a parent that we guarantee this skill is going to be taught to your kids, unless the teachers themselves have said, yes, we promise. In this unit, we're going to teach this skill for the next 2 weeks. And they look each other in the eye, they make that commitment, and then they develop an assessment to monitor whether or not the kids have learned it. So when they go into that unit, they know exactly what the kids must know and be able to do. They know exactly how long that unit is going to last. And they know, very importantly, what kids must be able to demonstrate in order to show that they've acquired the knowledge and skills. So a guaranteed curriculum is very, very important, but you don't get it by handing out documents.
Right. It's the same sort of concept or dynamic of teachers who say, well, I gave them the work, and you I think in several places that I recall reading the book is like, the schools don't open their doors for teachers to teach. They open the doors for students to learn. And so the idea that, well, I taught it to them and they just didn't get it, and it's on their responsibility. It's the same kind of concept. And so You really do a nice job, I think, of sort of diving into the idea of really the importance of formative assessment and that ongoing formative assessment, which again I think is a really vital part of PLCs, that you're really using PLCs and your collaborative time with your colleagues to formatively assess your progress in your work, right? Am I understanding that correctly?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in a PLC, you don't just assess in order to give grades. You're constantly checking for student understanding day by day in the classroom as an individual teacher and you've got all these strategies to keep checking and keep informing you. Are the kids ready? Should I move on? Do I need to restate this or have them practice this some more? But beyond that day-to-day check, in a PLC, periodically, the team every few weeks is going to stop and say, okay, let's as a team gather evidence of whether or not our kids are learning through these common assessments. And then here's I think a fork in the road for a lot of schools. They'll give the common assessment and they'll use it to identify the kids who didn't learn. And then they'll say, okay, well, those kids need to go into intervention. Now let's move on into the next unit. But the whole reason that we assign people into teams, we give them time to collaborate, we ask them to create a guaranteed curriculum and common assessments and time to analyze evidence of student learning, is really to improve and inform their professional practice. And so we ask teams, and there should be a protocol for doing this, we've suggested some, that at the end of every common assessment, the team should be asking, is there an area where one of our members really excelled? And if so, what were the strategies that our colleague used? And could we benefit from that? Or I look at my individual results and I recognize that my results are not nearly as good as the rest of the team. Here's an opportunity for me to figure out what are some additional instructional tools I can add to my toolbox so I can do a better job of teaching this. And if there's an area where none of us are getting the results that we'd hope for, then that should become an area of professional development. And the team has to say, well, where do we turn to now in order to learn how to teach this skill better? Is there an instructional coach? Is there someone from the central office? Is it something that we can post on the internet and ask for ideas from other teachers of our subject? Is there another team in the building who maybe has some ideas for us? So one of the points that we really try to emphasize is that unless you're using actual evidence of student learning to inform and improve your practice, you are not yet a professional learning community.
That wraps up the first of two parts of our podcast with Dr. DuFour. Please keep an eye out for the next episode, which will be part 2. And don't forget, if you're interested in our professional development services, to visit us at teachthought.com/PD.
That'll do it for today. Thanks for listening. If you didn't hate it, please give us a quick review on iTunes. We record weekly and sometimes multiple episodes per week. Questions? Email us at podcast@teachthought.com or find us on the Teach Thought Twitter account @TeachThought.